showtime. Welcome to Night Fright. I'm Brent Holland. Welcome to the show. Tonight, we bring it. We bring it for the memory and the glory of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Good evening, folks, and welcome to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland, and we're going to jump to it right away. On the phone, all the way from Birmingham, Alabama, live with us tonight, incredible researcher and a legend in his own right, Jim Douglas. Jim, welcome to the show.
Hello, Brent.
I was wondering, Jim, if maybe we could start off, maybe you can just tell the folks a little bit about what happened that fateful day, April 4, 1968.
Martin Luther King had returned to Memphis on April 3rd after what was an unsuccessful, a violent march that occurred in the city of Memphis, March 28th. He had gone to Memphis in support of the Memphis sanitation workers who were involved in a prolonged strike, suffering under terrible conditions in Memphis. And on March 28th, when he had come in to join a march that was just about to begin, the march was disrupted quickly by what turned out to be infiltrators, and the police engaged in a response to the violence in the march that killed one 16-year-old black teenager and resulted in a number of other people being hurt. King was taken away from the march quickly, and the upshot of all of that was that he returned to Memphis on April 3rd, the day before he would be assassinated, in order to show that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which he was leading, could engage in a nonviolent march in Memphis at a very critical moment in SCLC planning, because Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was organizing poor people all around the United States to take part in the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. So it was critically important for the work in Memphis to be concluded in a nonviolent way, not with that march on March 28th. So thus, on April 4th, the day after King arrived in Memphis, he was engaged in working with local organizers to plan for that march, which would probably take place on the 5th, or which would have been that weekend, or the following Monday.
I think it was the 8th, actually.
You mean that it actually took place?
That it was going to take place, yeah.
Well, they were shifting around, trying to find a time and get over an injunction that the local court had kept them from, that would keep them from marching. But on April 4th at 6 p.m., King came out on the balcony. He was going to go to dinner, and he was shot to death on the balcony, and the shot was said to have come from a boarding house across the street, where a man had registered that afternoon and had then disappeared, and that man was ultimately identified as James Earl Ray, especially because of a rifle that was dropped on the street 1 block away from the Lorraine Motel where King was killed, and the rifle was dropped in a doorway, along with a radio and other personal belongings that were all traced to a man named James Earl Ray, an escaped convict who escaped almost a year earlier than that from a prison in Missouri. And the radio that was dropped even had his prison number on it, so it was a dead giveaway as to who had dropped this rifle and the other personal belongings. And a number of weeks later, in early June, Ray was arrested in London after what the FBI called the greatest manhunt in history.
I want to come back to all the anomalies that, for myself, indicate right away intelligence and conspiracy. The pack, as you just mentioned, that was left outside that door was all too convenient, and it reminds me very much of what went on in Dallas 5 years earlier with Lee Harvey Oswald. But first, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about why Dr. King was assassinated. What forces were at work behind the scenes that felt Dr. King was a threat, and why was he a threat?
I think if we go back 1 year, actually 1 year to the day from King's assassination, that is back to April 4, 1967, we begin to get at the why. It was on that night at the Riverside Church in New York City that Martin Luther King gave his most important speech. Not necessarily, in fact, certainly not the one that has been given the most attention. It wasn't his I Have a Dream speech. It was his statement, almost an hour long, a carefully researched and enormously powerful indictment of the United States government for the Vietnam War. And that historic Riverside Church address set King on a direct collision with his own government. He stated in that speech that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. And he said that he could no longer even speak in any significant way to the young men, for example, in the streets of Los Angeles or Detroit or Chicago who were engaged in disruptions, riots, depending on how they were looked at the time, and who said when he pled with them for nonviolence, what about Vietnam? What about what our own government does in Vietnam? And in fact, many of those young people were veterans of Vietnam and had learned the violence that they were engaged in the streets of this country in service of the government in Vietnam. So King couldn't respond to those questions without addressing the war in Vietnam. He said he could not segregate his conscience. So that was number one. Number one was his stand against Vietnam, and that totally alienated him from the government led by President Lyndon Johnson. Up to that point, Johnson had been, in some response, had been responding to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. But once King stepped further into a nonviolent commitment, not only on civil rights but on the Vietnam War, Johnson cut off all ties with King. And J. Edgar Hoover, in particular, as head of the FBI, saw King as the primary enemy, internal enemy within the United States, and sent a memorandum to Lyndon Johnson right after that speech saying that King was clearly under the control of foreign forces.
Communists, specifically
and
China.
Not necessarily in the Soviet Union, also in China. So then, adding to that was the commitment to eliminate poverty in the United States, and in fact, beyond the United States. King gave a series of addresses on your side of the border in late 1967, that is, over Canadian radio. That
CBC.
Yeah, that's correct.
It was at Massey Hall, actually, in Toronto.
Form his last book, published after his death. And in those speeches, he unveils a vision of disrupting entire cities, beginning with Washington, D.C., through massive nonviolent civil disobedience in order to eliminate poverty. That is, if the United States government is not going to do what it was quite capable of doing, that is, using its resources to create a truly just society and one without poverty, then the poor people of the United States would show what that poverty was doing to them, and would, through nonviolent resistance, stop the ordinary workings of the government and the city of Washington. And King was committed to that. That was the step that he and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were going to do immediately after going to Memphis. Memphis was actually a kind of preliminary to the Poor People's Campaign in Washington. So those were the two critical issues. The Vietnam War, in which King's leadership was creating an enormous problem for the United States government because he was bringing the peace movement and the civil rights movement together, and then the Poor People's Campaign, which was dedicated to eliminating poverty, and which was thus challenging the economic structure of the United States at the time. So King had become a mortal enemy to the power structure that was actually more behind than actually in the United States government.
The speech you mentioned, the Dr. King anti-war speech of April 4, 1967, 1 year to the day when Dr. King was assassinated. I actually have an excerpt of that I would like to play for the folks, just so they can hear his articulations and
Please
some
do.
of what he said. And I'm going to play that right now.
A time comes when silence is betrayal. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. But we must move on. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. I speak for the poor of America, who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as one who loves America. To the leaders of our own nation, the great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. The choice is ours. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Folks, if you're just joining us, that was Dr. Martin Luther King's speech. It was a speech he made on April 4, 1967, a year to the day before he was assassinated. It's a speech that basically brought forth his policy into one including all of mankind. He was kind of moving away from civil rights. He was invoking a new policy on unbridled peace right across the world. He wanted to end war, period. In particular, a war that was raging right at home in the 60s in the United States, the Vietnam War.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
We are indeed speaking with none other than Jim Douglas. Jim Douglas is a bit of a legend, actually, in the JFK Martin Luther King research community. He has a terrific book out, which I have read twice. The book is called JFK and the Unspeakable, and you can pick it up at any Chapters or Indigo right across the country. And I highly recommend it. He's a terrific writer, a terrific researcher, and I think you're going to enjoy what he has to say. And he brings a unique perspective. He ties it all in together. Men who speak out against war end up being targeted and ultimately assassinated. Men who wanted change. Men who had the vision to end the violence. Jim, I want to get into the trial that you covered.
Sure.
Now, you were one of only 2 reporters covering a trial of, and I quote, wrongful death lawsuit. And this trial was brought about by the King family against a fellow by the name of Lloyd Jowers. I wonder, Jim, could you give us an overview of the trial and William Pepper's involvement and your impression of the trial?
The trial took place only a few blocks from the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where Dr. King was assassinated. It was a 6-week-long trial, began on 3-week-long trial, began on November 15th of 1999, ended on December the 8th, and I attended the entire trial. It was, as you said, a wrongful death lawsuit initiated by Coretta King and her children by the King family. There was only one named defendant in this wrongful death lawsuit, and that was Lloyd Jowers, who owned the
cafe
grill. It's called Jim's Grill, just across the street, across a vacant lot, and who was actually confessed to a role in the killing of Dr. King. My impressions of the trial, it was overwhelming. There were 70 witnesses. The testimony portrayed a conspiracy that involved the United States government, agencies within the U.S. government, FBI, CIA, members of the Memphis Police Department, an Army Special Forces sniper team, and also mafia intermediaries who could be scapegoated, and the involvement of the one individual scapegoat, James Earl Ray.
Jim, can I just read a quote?
Sure.
This is from an article Jim wrote that was in a magazine called Probe Magazine. You can still get it online, folks. Just do Google for Jim Douglas, Martin Luther King. I'm sure you're going to come up with it. It's called The Martin Luther King Conspiracy Exposed, and this is an article by Jim. In it, you write about the upcoming trial and a quote which I thought was really, really explosive, which says, "The Kings and Pepper were in effect charging U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly the FBI and Army intelligence, with organizing, subcontracting, and covering up the assassination." I just thought that was completely accurate and explosive at the same time, because you bring it all into focus right there with that one statement.
Those were the unindicted, unnamed co-conspirators. The King family could not directly name them, but they all became step-by-step role players in the assassination as the testimony in the courtroom went on. It was clear from the beginning that the King family were not in it in order to get any money. They asked for $100 from the defendant, which is ridiculous for the murder of the greatest prophet in American history. What they were trying to do, very explicitly, they said this, was to put on record who was actually involved in the assassination. So, as Lloyd Jowers' confession was played, actually, it had been tape recorded when he confessed to Andrew Young, former ambassador to the United Nations and members of the King family. The recording from that confession was played, and Jowers was describing a conspiracy which he was part of as a role player handling the gun, and witnessing members of the FBI and CIA and police department meeting in his bar and grill. And then that got fleshed out further in the course of the trial by testimony concerning the different involvements of each of those institutions. So the King family didn't name these people in the wrongful death lawsuit, but we saw them in action through the testimony of the trial.
Can we talk about Lloyd Jowers a little bit in terms of his physical appearance, his age? Because I understand he was quite elderly and frail in, I think it was it 1998, the trial, Jim?
99. It was just before the turn of the century. He was 73 years old. He was extremely ill. He was actually excused from being in the courtroom after several days, and he didn't testify directly, but his confession was played, and people who had seen him give that confession. I'd like to say something about Lloyd Jowers and Coretta Scott King. It was probably the most moving moment in the entire trial. I was sitting right behind Mr. Jowers when he was in the courtroom. It was a very small courtroom. There was room for only about 30 or so spectators at the most, and there weren't even that many in for much of the trial, which was totally amazing that there weren't more people present. But when Coretta King came in to testify at the trial, she walked up toward Mr. Jowers. Now, Mr. Jowers was well known to her as the man who had said that the gun was passed to him immediately after the killing of Martin Luther King. It's just as likely that Jowers himself pulled the trigger that killed Martin Luther King. He's the only witness to this event, and he did confess to that involvement, but he may not have confessed to his total involvement. So she was quite aware of that as she walked up to him, and he was quite aware of that relationship as he, in kind of total confusion, rose to his feet. And at that moment, and I was sitting about 3 feet away, Coretta King looked directly into the eyes of this man who may have pulled the trigger that killed her husband, who certainly was directly involved in that action. And she reached out her hand and she shook his hand and looked into his eyes.
Wow.
That, to me, was the most amazing moment in the entire trial, a moment of forgiveness and of nonviolence that went right to the heart of what Martin Luther King stood for.
What a beautiful moment. So your gut feeling about Lloyd Jowers is that he may have been indeed the assassin?
I don't know. There is only one person who has testified to that moment of getting the gun, and that's Lloyd Jowers. And Lloyd Jowers, up to that stage, had been denying his involvement. By the way, there's a train going by my house.
That's fine. We have them go by here too, so you.
I live next to the railroad tracks in Birmingham, Alabama.
So do we. So, no problem.
Yeah. So Lloyd Jowers, he would never even have come to the point of acknowledging his involvement in the assassination had not William Pepper, whom you've already mentioned, and who had become the attorney for the Kings. he had gained more and more evidence against Lloyd Jowers, and then Lloyd Jowers decided that he'd better try to put himself in a position where he could acknowledge his involvement in the assassination, but not necessarily say everything that he was involved in. So he was in effect cornered, but he wasn't cornered so totally that he may not have said exactly what he was doing.
Now, the prosecution lawyer, William Pepper, was a personal friend of Dr. King's in the 60s.
That's correct.
What prompted Mr. Pepper to follow through with a trial? Was he exposed to information that the public was not exposed to?
Well, let's go back to what you just said about Pepper and Martin Luther King, because he had a significant role in Martin Luther King's own pilgrimage. Mm-hmm. There's a point in any biography that you read about Martin Luther King where he's confronted by some photos that had an enormous impact on him that are of napalmed children in Vietnam. The scene that you read in these different biographies is of him sitting in an airport restaurant and being unable to eat his dinner because he's just looked at these photos in a magazine called Ramparts. It's a photojournalistic essay that was published in Ramparts, and his friend who's across from him in the table says, "Why aren't you eating your dinner, Martin?" He says, "I don't know if I can ever eat again after what I just looked at." Those photos were taken by William Pepper after having been on a trip to Vietnam, and William Pepper then eventually met Martin Luther King and was actually encouraging him to run for President of the United States, and King chose not to. But Pepper, in many years later, came to represent James Earl Ray, the accused and convicted assassin of Martin Luther King, after Ralph Abernathy, King's successor, as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, contacted Pepper as an attorney and said that Abernathy, didn't think Ray was guilty of killing King. So from that point on, in the 1980s, William Pepper was doing research on behalf of Abernathy and then other people to try to free James Earl Ray, because it became more and more obvious to Pepper that Ray, in fact, wasn't guilty. Pepper hadn't had any real questions about Ray up to that point. He had sort of retreated totally from the work in civil rights and political change to a large degree because of what had happened to King. But through the 1980s, he worked to try to free James Earl Ray, and then in the 90s, the King family was alerted to what Pepper was doing, and they became involved. And actually, one of them, the oldest son, Dexter. Well, actually, he's not the oldest son, but he went to the prison of James Earl Ray and talked to him and decided he didn't kill King, and after having been presented with the evidence by Pepper and then actually interviewing Ray. So the attorney who represented James Earl Ray then came to represent the King family. James Earl Ray died in prison, but the King family then took on the same attorney. So that in itself shows just how profoundly the evidence that Pepper uncovered affected the King family.
And certainly I want to talk about that. Right now I've got to do a quick station break.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
folks, you are listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland, and you're listening to CKLU 96.7 FM, Laurentian University in beautiful Sudbury, and spring is upon us. We broadcast every Wednesday between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, and 10 o'clock and midnight. You're listening to Caper Radio in Cape Breton University, beautiful Sydney, Nova Scotia, God's country. Wednesdays between 3:30 in the afternoon and 5:30. CILU 102.7 FM, Lakehead University in Rock and Thunder Bay, Sunday night at midnight. Say hey to everybody there. CJMQ 88.9 FM, the voice of the Eastern Townships in Sherbrooke, Quebec. And that's every Saturday between 9 and 11 p.m. CJUM 101.5 FM, University of Manitoba, another beautiful campus here in Canada. Winnipeg, Manitoba, Wednesday nights, Thursday mornings at 1 a.m. Sound FM 100.3 FM, University of Waterloo, Ontario. Sunday night, Monday mornings, 3 shows back to back, 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. CKXU 88.3 FM, University of Lethbridge, Alberta. Friday night at midnight.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
And folks, if you're just joining us, we are speaking with Jim Douglas. Jim Douglas is a researcher, investigative reporter, I guess I could say. He is
actually a peace activist.
There you go, even better. A peace activist, somebody who cares about peace and people.
We have a Catholic worker house for homeless families here in Birmingham.
Oh, would you like to talk about that? And maybe people can help out in some...
Well, we just do the kind of thing that we were inspired to do by Dorothy Day, a woman who founded the Catholic Worker Movement, and we do peace and justice work, and Shelley, my wife, and I have been to Iraq 7 times, I think, to do work in Iraq. We challenged with a group called Voices in the Wilderness the sanctions that killed over 500,000 children under the age of 5 during the 1990s up to the time of the current war in Iraq. And we've tried to do what we can to stop the current war as well. And I was in Baghdad during shock and awe, the beginning of the war in Iraq, and so we've tried to stand where we think Martin Luther King would have, were he living today. It's the current version of the Vietnam War, as will be the war in Afghanistan to the extent that escalates.
You're a very brave man, and so is your wife. If folks wanted to get in touch with you, Jim, in order to help out in whatever circumstances they could, would you have a contact address or information?
They could write to Mary's House, which is the name of our Catholic Worker House. It's at 2107 Avenue G, and that's in Birmingham, Alabama, and the zip code is 35218.
Okay, so folks, if you're interested in helping out in any way, please do contact Jim Douglas.
Or just come visit us when you come down this way. By the way, I came down this way. I was born in Headley. I grew up in Headley, British Columbia, Canada, and was born in Princeton, just down the valley from Headley. So I came down here, and I'm still a citizen of both the U.S. and Canada.
That's great. So, folks, if you do go down to visit Jim, bring him a hockey stick.
Please do.
You know, you may end up with the whole country down there.
That would be great. It would be. I don't think that borders are the most important thing in the world. People are, and the more we can act beyond borders, the better.
That's beautiful. Let's come back to Dr. King, because that is the focal point of the show, but I'm very interested in your peace activities. Can we talk a little bit more about what you experienced in Iraq, just so folks that are out there that haven't experienced war or conflict, and thank God for that, what it was like for you, what you experienced?
what we tried to do was go to the points that we saw were most vulnerable in Iraq during that first week of the war. So I was at a water treatment plant quite a bit, because during the Persian Gulf War in the early 90s, the earlier destruction of Baghdad, the water treatment facilities were bombed intensely, which then, together with the economic sanctions during the 1990s, created a situation of genocide, because there was no way to repair those facilities under the sanctions, and the people were unable to have water that didn't have waste materials in that water, so the children were dying without medicines. And so in the first week of the war, we went to those water treatment facilities, and the one I was at was not bombed, but that's the kind of thing we tried to do. And the situation was one of terror. We talk about terrorism. There's no terror that equals that of being under the bombing of the most powerful military force in history, and with really no defense whatsoever. I saw the Iraqi army. It was pitiful, and the incoming explosions, there was nothing to deter them or to offset them. Of course, they were being sent in from battleships and guided missiles, and it was, and yet the people, the one thing that I found profoundly moving in that situation was every time a bomb landed somewhere in the city, I was in the water treatment facility during a lot of this time, there was a mosque quite nearby, and the prayer would be said immediately after the bombing, and I would be praying the Lord's Prayer, and then I would hear the Muslim prayer from the mosque almost simultaneously, and so that was the only real genuine response that the city could give in that instance, was the Muslim, the Islamic prayer, or the Christian prayer, depending on who was praying.
That's inspiring, Jim. That truly is.
Amen.
Yeah, exactly.
We are all married to Muslims in one way or another, or to Christians, depending on whether we are Muslim or Christian, or to Buddhists, depending on whether we are all married to one another. Is a symbol of the marriage of all of us. Precisely.
We are all one of the same. We are all part and parcel. We are all intrinsically connected.
Which is what Dr. Martin Luther King called the beloved community, and that's what his assassination is all about, an effort to destroy that vision and keep it from overwhelming those of exploitation and war.
In your background, Jim, did you grow up being inspired by John Kennedy, Malcolm, Bobby, and Martin?
Not by John Kennedy. I was writing articles that were quite critical of his nuclear policies, and I think rightly so, given what I knew about them. I was inspired by Martin Luther King because of his vision of nonviolence, which was more consistent in my understanding than that of John Kennedy's, which was of justifying, from my standpoint at that time, with what little I knew about Kennedy, limited nuclear war. And Malcolm X, I was inspired by to some degree because I saw him as a person of deep truth, and then Robert Kennedy, I was moved by him. But I think John Kennedy least of all. Now that's not my perspective nowadays. You asked me about what I was like in the early...
No, and that is a fair answer and a fair question.
Yes, and John Kennedy, it's only in the 1990s and really in the last 5 to 10 years that I've come to understand what was really going on through intense research into his administration and into his assassination.
Can I plug your book? It is JFK and the Unspeakable. It can be got at any Chapters in Indigo across the country. And actually, in the book, I've read the book, as I said, twice. I'm going to paraphrase the title of the chapter. It says, A Cold Warrior Turns to Peace. And basically it talks about how John Kennedy, primarily after the Bay of Pigs, but mostly after the missile crisis, the October missile crisis, where the world almost killed itself, he started to turn to peace, and he started to see the light. And we talked before, Jim, in a pre-production meeting, is the various parallels between the assassinations, and particularly the Martin Luther King assassination and the JFK assassination. And it seems as soon as these men turned from the war machine against the war machine and became doves, that's when they seemed to be targeted. And you had mentioned the American University speech that Kennedy gave as a parallel, and I think a justifiable one and a great parallel, to Dr. King's speech that he gave April 4th, 1967. I've got the clip of the American University speech. I was wondering if you could set it up for us.
Well, John Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was, like his adversary, Nikita Khrushchev, committed to turning in a new direction. They had literally been terrified and enlightened at the same time by what they had almost done in the missile crisis, what their military had almost done. And in the midst of that crisis, Kennedy had actually reached out to Khrushchev and said, I need your help, because his military forces were pushing in every way they could to commit toward that nuclear war that Kennedy was trying to avoid, even as he had, to some degree, taken the government to that point. And when he felt that he had lost control of the situation, Kennedy sent RFK, his brother, the Attorney General, secretly to Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, said, we need your help to get out of this. And O'Brien wired Khrushchev in Moscow, and Khrushchev turned to his foreign minister and said, we have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him. We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war. And at that point, everything turned upside down, and those two leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, became closer to each other than either was to his own military. And by the time of June 1963, over half a year later, Kennedy was struggling for a wave to for him and Khrushchev to sign a nuclear test ban treaty. So he decided to take the initiative, and he did so in that speech in which he reached out to the Soviet Union by describing to his own citizens at this commencement opportunity at American University, Washington, D.C., he described the suffering of the Russian people at the end of the Second World War, and said that would be nothing compared to what a nuclear war would be like. And I think he wanted to play something about play something of that speech.
Okay, I'm going to play it right now.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
And that was John Kennedy's speech in the summer of 1963, just a few months before he was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963. What got me is when he just came right up and challenged the military there. He said, we can't justify this stockpile anymore, or the expenditure. We cannot risk war in a nuclear environment. And I'm just wondering what kind of residual forces were sparked into action by his statement in the military complex. That's an open question to you, Jim. Any speculation on that?
Not speculation, but concrete evidence. We have the tape recordings of Kennedy meeting with those military advisors, even in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, led especially by General Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force at the time, who was itching to win, as in his terms, the Cold War by a first strike against the Soviet Union. Yeah. And in the midst of the missile crisis, he, in a very arrogant and domineering way, told Kennedy, and we have this on tape, because Kennedy was recording it unknown to Curtis LeMay. LeMay said that Kennedy was surrendering to the Soviets because he wasn't preparing to attack the missile sites in Cuba. He wasn't preparing an aggressive response to the Soviets placing the missiles in Cuba. Instead, he was just engaged in this quarantine, this blockade, and Kennedy rejected the Joint Chiefs' statement that he had to invade Cuba, that he had to destroy these missiles, which via then, of course, would have begun a Third World War, much more destructive than anything before. The Joint Chiefs were saying the missiles weren't armed. They were in fact already armed with nuclear warheads, unknown to the Joint Chiefs. And when Kennedy left the room, then the tape recorder kept on recording, and General Curtis LeMay and another man can be heard basically cursing out the president. So we know what these guys thought about Kennedy. And when he, after the conclusion of the missile crisis, after he and Khrushchev had agreed to a mutual concessions, Khrushchev withdrew the missiles, and Kennedy pulled his out of Turkey next to the Soviet Union, and Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba. The Joint Chiefs were enraged, and they came into his office and basically cursed him out. That's the attitude that these people had toward Kennedy, and we know the meetings at which they were presenting to him a plan to strike first against the Soviet Union. They did this both in 1961 and in 1963. We have the records in detail of those meetings. Kennedy refused, and the last opportunity they would have in terms of the window of opportunity to destroy Soviet missiles, because of an overwhelming preponderance of U.S. missiles, before the Soviets got enough of a deterrent to make that impossible. The last month that they would have an opportunity to do that was November 1963, and that was part of the plot to kill John F. Kennedy. The plot was to blame it on Lee Harvey Oswald, not simply as an individual, but as a representative of the Soviet Union and Cuba, representing their interests, and therefore justify a first strike attack against Cuba and the Soviet Union. The plot to kill Kennedy went much more deeply into evil than just to kill the President of the United States. It was to, quote, win the Cold War by attacking the major enemies of the U.S., precisely those enemies with whom Kennedy was trying to negotiate.
I just wanted to mention to you, too, you probably know this already. I've been reading a pile of books to do research for this series, and in one of the books I've been reading, it could have even been your article, I can't remember, we were talking about General LeMay. Well, apparently General Walker was going to run for President of the United States, and he wanted Curtis LeMay to be his running mate.
That's right.
It's chilling, absolutely chilling. Folks, you probably don't know who General Walker is. He was removed from power, if you will, in the same circumstances that General MacArthur basically was removed from power because he wasn't following orders. He was making his own policy, and he was a bit of a white racist also. Yes. And to think that he would take a Joint Chiefs of Staff and offer him a position and accepted the position, Curtis LeMay, absolutely chilling. They would have started a war for sure, without question.
John F. Kennedy had removed Walker from his position.
That's right. I should have mentioned that. You're absolutely right.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Folks, if you're just joining us, we're talking with Jim Douglas. We're talking about the parallels between the JFK assassination right now and the parallels between the Martin Luther King assassination. Jim, I'm wondering if we can go back. Well, just let me plug your book one more time. JFK and the Unspeakable. You can pick it up at any Chapters Indigo right across the country. Do you have a website, by the way?
Not really.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm the only writer in North America who doesn't have a website.
That's no, fair enough.
But the publisher does. It's Orbis Books, ORBIS, Orbis Books.
.com, is it, or?
I don't know. Just go to
Google.
Go to Orbis Books.
Okay, do a Google, folks, and you'll find it.
Yeah.
Or just pick it up at, as I say, Chapters Indigo, where I got it. Terrific.
Sure.
It's a terrific book, actually. Let's go back to Dr. King. Let's talk about some of those anomalies. Now that we've established why he was killed, because he came out for peace, and he was seen as a real threat by the Johnson administration because, my goodness, he was going to organize this huge rally right in the center of Washington, and he was talking about paralyzing cities in order to bring a more equitable sharing of the wealth right across the country, the world itself, and to stop war. Finally stop war. And I think it would have snowballed. I think this movement would have snowballed and gone right around the world, because how many people want war? No one. Absolutely no one wants a war. So I think it would have snowballed, and I think that's why he was, as John F. Kennedy was removed and Malcolm was removed, and Bobby would later be removed just 2 months after Dr. King, I think that's why Dr. King was removed. He was seen as a threat, an advocate of peace. Let's talk about some of these anomalies, and let's talk about the big one, the very convenient package you had mentioned before that was purportedly left by James Earl Ray just outside of the rooming house where he was supposed to have made the fatal shot to Dr. King. And he just left this package, folks, and this package contained toiletry items, but it also left the gun, it left some ammunition, and it also left something very convenient, a radio. Now, this radio on the inside had scratched a number inside it, and this number represented James Earl Ray's inmate's number. So it was very easy to trace it right back to James Earl Ray. A little bit convenient there. Can we talk about this bag? And we'll get into the Mustangs and everything else after? Sure.
The witness who addressed this point in the trial that I attended was a circuit court judge here in Birmingham, Alabama, whom I've interviewed personally, named Arthur Haynes, Jr., who with his father was an attorney for Ray on the for his trial, and on the eve of the trial, Ray, under pressure, great pressure, replaced Haynes and his father, Arthur Haynes Sr., by another attorney, Percy Foreman. But anyhow, in the trial that I attended, Haynes said what he had learned while he was doing research on behalf of Ray to defend him. And he interviewed Guy Knipe, now deceased, the man who owned the store, whose doorway was the place where the rifle that you just described and the radio were dropped. And Arthur Haynes Jr., whom I know from people here in Birmingham, is quite a well-respected attorney and circuit court judge. He said that Guy Knipe, the owner of the store, had told him that the package, which included the rifle and the radio, was dropped in his doorway by a man heading south down that street called Main Street 10 minutes before the shot was fired that killed Martin Luther King. Let me repeat that.
Yes, please.
The rifle that supposedly killed Martin Luther King, with fingerprints of James Earl Ray on the rifle, was dropped 10 minutes before the shot that was fired, that he heard that would kill Martin Luther King. Now, Haynes didn't contest whether or not Ray's fingerprints were on that rifle. In fact, Ray himself has said, in his description of what happened that day, he said, "Sure, that my fingerprints were on that rifle. I bought that rifle in Birmingham, Alabama, the town where I'm talking from right now." And he said, "I bought it at the behest of a man who was controlling me during those days and telling me what to do." So he had, in fact, by his own admission, bought the rifle. But that's not to say that that rifle killed Martin Luther King, or that James Earl Ray dropped the rifle in that doorway. Somebody did, and somebody did 10 minutes before the shot was fired. That raises some pretty serious questions.
I would say right away, red flag, without hesitation.
A pretty big red flag.
Oh, yeah. And, whenever I hear something like that in a case of this magnitude, right away I think military intelligence. Now, in fact, there was some military intelligence that was in the area. I was wondering if you could talk about them.
Well, the military intelligence was following Dr. Martin Luther King 24 hours a day, as was the civilian intelligence. King, every word that King said was being recorded,
right.
Either from conversations on the phone or from conversations in rooms. If he was in a hotel, the room was being tape recorded everywhere. They had these microphones all over the place. And practically everything that King said in the weeks before his death was on tape. This is well documented today from multiple sources within the U.S. government, and the Army intelligence was a part of that process. But there was actually a man who came into the fire station across the street, and who was on the roof of the fire station when Martin Luther King was killed, who was part of military intelligence. And the man who took him up to the roof testified in the trial. And so that was just one example of the way in which military intelligence was following everything that Martin Luther King was doing in the weeks before. But everything that King said was being taped and transcribed to intelligence sources.
Can we now discuss what Jowers said about a fellow by the name of Frank Liberto?
Well, it wasn't so much Jowers as it was a couple of other witnesses in the trial. Jowers did describe Frank Liberto having connected with him and passing money to him, $100,000 for him to hold at his restaurant. But there was a store owner who lived outside Memphis who said he actually heard Frank Liberto speak about King at about 5:15 p.m. on April 4, 1968. In other words, 3/4 of an hour before King was killed. John McFerrin, an African-American man who was active in the civil rights movement, he went to Frank Liberto being a mobster and also a man involved in having a warehouse and doing work with produce in Memphis. John McFerrin went for a produce pickup at Frank Liberto's warehouse there, and when he approached the warehouse office that afternoon at 5:15, he overheard Liberto on the phone inside saying, "Shoot the son of a bitch on the balcony." And from that point on, when McFerrin began to come forward with that information, he was terrorized throughout the decades preceding this trial. It took a lot of courage for him to come forward at various points, and there were times when he felt he couldn't do that. And he testified in the trial to having heard that statement from Liberto. And then a woman who was a friend of Liberto's, she testified in the trial, and so did her son, about Liberto saying that he had Martin Luther King killed, and they were testifying to one level of the assassination because
Jim,
just as in the Kennedy assassination, mobsters were used as intermediaries. Go ahead.
Jim, I just wanted to put the quote out there because it is such a horrible thing that he said. And this is a quote that has been connected to Frank Liberto. And
yes.
Liberto says, "I didn't kill the nigger," meaning Dr. King. "I had it done."
That's right.
Also, I want to mention, just to give you a background of what African Americans were dealing with in those days, going back to the person that heard Liberto say that kill him when he comes out on the balcony, the fellow by the name of John McFerrin, he was just completely marginalized, like he wasn't even in the room when Liberto was telling this on the telephone. It's like he didn't even exist.
That's exactly right.
And it's so sad.
They didn't want Martin Luther King to exist.
Exactly. Can we talk about this mysterious figure, Raul?
Sure. Well, Raul first appeared in people's understanding through James Earl Ray. Ray is the person who began talking about Raul, and he did so after he pled guilty under a lot of pressure, especially from this new attorney of his, Foreman. And when Ray then began saying, well, he had really been following the directions of this man named Raul, he claimed to have met him in Canada, in Montreal, after he had escaped from prison. Ray, within a month after King made that powerful speech at Riverside Church, James Earl Ray escaped from a prison in Missouri. The question is, did he escape, or was he allowed to?
Well, this is it,
was he allowed to walk
Yeah.
out of that place? And there's no one more vulnerable to the work of intelligence agencies than an escaped prisoner, because, of course, at any point he can be put right back in jail. He's under the total control of whoever.
Nagel.
Yeah, whoever wants to control him. And according to James Earl Ray's story, he met Raul that following summer up in Montreal, and from that point on, he was following orders, doing what Raul told him to do, and it involved smuggling weapons across borders, both the Canadian-U.S. and the U.S.-Mexican border, and being engaged in especially arms smuggling around in various places, and supposedly that was part of why he purchased that rifle here in Birmingham. But Raul then appears in the testimony of the trial from several points of view, including a woman who was sitting next to me during the trial, who was a reporter from Portugal. She was the only other person in the courtroom from time to time who represented the media. You could hardly say I represented the media. I'm a writer of books, but she was from a Lisbon publication called the Publico, daily publication Publico, and she had found the man named Raul, thanks to the research of William Pepper and other people in the 1990s. They had found some evidence of this man named Raul that James Earl Ray had claimed had shepherded him around the U.S., and they traced him to a location in the U.S. And this woman had gone to his house and had talked to members of his family, and she was called to the stand by William Pepper without her knowing that he was going to do so. She was extremely angry at his having called her as a witness, but she testified truthfully and said that she had been told by the members of this man, Raul's family, that the U.S. government was supporting them and that they were confident that they wouldn't be, really confronted on the issue. There were other witnesses in the trial who said that they had known of Raul in one connection or another, and that and one woman who did not appear in the trial for medical reasons, whom I interviewed personally, Glenda Grabo is her name. She told me in an interview that I did with her, just as her brother did on the stand in the trial, that she had known Raul in the decade after the assassination of King, and that Raul had confessed to her that he was one of the killers of Martin Luther King.
Oh man, that's explosive. I've just got to do this station break, but when we come back, I'm not sure if you know, I hail originally from Montreal. I've only been in Sudbury for a little over a year, and it's beautiful here. But I did a little research on my own about the club 121 de la Commune West, where Raul originally met up with James Earl Ray. And I want to talk about that a little bit, and a Lee Harvey Oswald connection that I think you may not know about. But I'm going to come back to that in just a second.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
You are listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland, and we are very blessed tonight to be speaking with one of the premier researchers in the JFK Martin Luther King assassination, none other than Jim Douglas. And Jim has a great book out called JFK and the Unspeakable, which can be got anywhere across the country at Chapters Indigo. You are listening to CKLU 96.7 FM, Laurentian University, Sudbury. Wednesdays between 3 and 5 in the afternoon and 10 and midnight at night we broadcast. I want to say hi to Deborah Frankel, and thank you so much for supporting us. Caper Radio, Cape Breton University, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Wednesdays between 3:30 and 5:30 in the afternoon. I want to say hello to Matthew Burke. Hope things are well. CILU 102.7 FM, Lakehead University, Thunder Bay, Ontario. Sunday night at midnight. Hey, Jason Wellwood, how are things in Thunder Bay? CJMQ 88.9 FM, the voice of the Eastern Townships in Sherbrooke, Quebec. I want to say hi to David Teasdale. And you can hear Night Fright every Saturday between 9 and 11 p.m. And if you're listening right now in Sherbrooke, Quebec, salut, bonjour, merci beaucoup, et vous êtes très gentil. CJUM 101.5 FM, University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Beautiful, beautiful campus there. Wednesday nights, Thursday mornings, 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. I want to say hey to Jared McKitiak. Hope things are well with you and the wife and the new baby. Sound FM 100.3 FM. Hey Road Dog, my buddy Road Dog, what a great guy. University of Waterloo, Waterloo, Ontario. Sunday nights, Monday mornings, 3 shows back-to-back, 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. And if you are listening to these shows, again, thank you very much for listening. CKXU 88.3 FM, University of Lethbridge. We are blessed with all these great universities here in Canada. Lethbridge, Alberta, of course, Friday nights at midnight. Hi, Alan Gillespie. Hope things are well with you too, my friend.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
I'm going to bring it back and talk about a little bit of a connection between James Earl Ray, Montreal in the middle, and Lee Harvey Oswald. There is a club that is right across from the docks in Montreal. Expo 67 was a year. I think he met Raul, was it May, if I'm not mistaken? Or was it the summertime?
I think it was a little later than that, but go ahead.
Okay. And the club in those days, right now it's a restaurant, a little bistro type of thing, and I've eaten there many times actually with friends.
Yes.
But in those days it was a gay club.
Yes.
And right around the corner, not too far from there, I would say 2 or 3 blocks, 5 years earlier is where Lee Harvey Oswald is reported to have been giving out pamphlets on Free Cuba, the same way he did in New Orleans that summer. And I just thought, that's a little bit close. And why would 2 of the biggest purported assassins of 2 of the biggest assassinations in history have Montreal in common and only be virtually around the corner from each other 5 years apart? So I will send you the map if you'd like. I've mapped this out.
It.
And you know what's right up the street from there?
No.
The Allen Memorial.
RFK assassination.
Isn't this wild? You know, MK Ultra and mind control. There was some talk that Ray may have been hypnotized, and perhaps Oswald too. And,
sure.
And Sirhan. So what is going on in Montreal? I have no idea. All that to say, I would be happy to send you the map as I've mapped it out.
Yeah, I'd be interested. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome, my friend. And folks, if you are again just joining us, we're talking about the Martin Luther King assassination. This is our final night. This is our 5th show on the Martin Luther King assassination. And we are talking tonight about the conspiracy that was afoot to kill Dr. King. And more importantly, we're talking about a trial that took place in 1999 that was brought to the public, and only 2 reporters covered it. And I'm going to call you a reporter just for clarification. Jim Douglas was one, who is our guest tonight, and a young lady from a paper in Lisbon called The Publico.
Actually, to clarify,
Please.
She was there only for very few days.
Oh, I see.
The other person who was there for the entire trial, and to whom if I may, I'd like to dedicate this program, is a man named Wendell Stacey. Wendell Stacey. Yes. And may I say why I'd like to dedicate the program to Wendell?
Please.
Wendell was a very well-known anchor of a Memphis TV station at the time of the King assassination trial in December 99. He didn't know really anything about the King assassination. He came as a skeptic to the trial, but he became very deeply convinced of the involvement of the U.S. government as a reporter at the trial, and he engaged his station in a debate. I mean, he wanted to cover that trial more and more and more. And he wanted to bring out everything he could on it, and they wouldn't allow him to. And afterwards, he wanted to pursue the story of the King assassination after the jury found that King was, in fact, killed by a conspiracy. And he pushed it so hard that he was fired by the station. And in the years following, he did a lawsuit against the station. He eventually won that lawsuit many years later, never received much money for it, and he continued by the videotaping he had done of the trial to cover the issue to the point where his videotapes of the trial were used on a prime time hour-long television show in Germany and France that played several years ago, so that, in effect, the people of France and Germany know more about the assassination of Martin Luther King than the people of the United States do. And when Wendell Stacey became a resource for that, he was being threatened regularly on the phone. Wendell and I kept in constant contact during these days, and his house was broken into, and his vehicle blew up, almost killed him. And 1 year ago, last August, after I was talking to Wendell a lot, trying to support him any way I could, I received a call from a mutual friend in Memphis saying that Wendell had been found dead in his home, and that of undisclosed sources, and there was no autopsy done. Wendell Stacey was a very, very courageous person who tried as best he could to pursue the truth of Martin Luther King assassination, and he too, like Martin Luther King himself, is a witness to the unspeakable. So we need to be inspired by Wendell's commitment to the truth and do everything we can to pursue and open up that truth. He's an example of a number of other people who have spoken out or pursued the truth, whom I described, for example, in the book on the JFK assassination. So it's not simply John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King who is a witness to the truth. It's these people who may, by circumstances, have somehow been brought into the orbit of the unspeakable and of the truth of justice and peace, and who chose to be courageous enough to speak out to it, and who suffered the same kinds of consequences.
I was just going to say, folks, if you are a budding journalist, if you're out there thinking about what to do with your lives, if you're in university right now, you're a journalist, you want to grab the bull by the horns like these folks have.
Amen. As we say in Birmingham, Alabama. Absolutely.
We say here too.
Grab the bull by the horns and toss the bull for a loop, as Wendell Stacey was doing.
And you can do it.
You can.
You can.
Absolutely.
These folks are testament to that fact.
Absolutely.
Their courage, their bravery will not go unremembered. Take what they have built on and build on it yourself. You can go out there and you can do this. There are mysteries out there that have to be told. There are secrets yet to be revealed. It is your responsibility as a human being, a citizen of this planet, to go out there and find the truth.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Let's go back to Dr. King and amen to Mr. Stacey. Jim, when you were in the trial, you were present right there.
Yes.
What were some of the things that kind of cried out to you, maybe some of the things that the public may not be aware of? I know there was a lot of controversy over the gun. I know Judge Joe Brown wanted to have the gun re-examined, and with good reason. I wonder if we could speak to that, but also speak to the integrity of the King family and also Mr. Pepper.
Well, there was an earlier series of hearings that were conducted by Judge Joe Brown, who is now well known because he has a television show. Mm-hmm. In those days, he was far less known. And I first went to that courthouse and went into Judge Joe Brown's courtroom to hear the testimony on the rifle. This was when Ray was still alive, and when Pepper was trying to get a new trial for him. And the testing of the rifle to determine this is the rifle that had been dropped 10 minutes before the shot was fired. But of course, that testimony came in a different context in the trial. We're talking about hearings now that took place in 96, 97, that period of time. and that rifle was coming closer and closer toward the conclusion by the testing that was being done under the instruction of Judge Joe Brown, to a point where it would be ruled out as even possibly a rifle that could have shot the bullets that killed the bullet that killed Martin Luther King. And that's when Judge Joe Brown was removed from the case, supposedly because he was not objective enough. And then James Earl Ray died, and it became a moot point. But Judge Joe Brown then testified in the trial, and he said not only was the testing of the rifle proving that, but he said that because the rifle hadn't been sighted properly,
exactly,
it couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn. Brown is an expert in rifles, and he said that there's no way that rifle could have killed anyone on the day that Martin Luther King was shot. But another point of testimony, we're getting into testimony here now, that was extremely striking in the trial was by a man named Maynard Stiles, who on the day of the assassination and the days following, he was a member of the Memphis Sanitation Department, an official in the Memphis Sanitation Department, and he testified in the trial that on the day after King's assassination, at about 7 a.m., he told the jury that he got a phone call from the inspector above him in the Memphis Police Department, a man named Sam Evans, telling him to clear the brush and debris from a vacant lot in the vicinity of the assassination. And when Stiles got to the location, he realized this was right across the street from where King came out in the balcony and was shot. And as we would learn in the trial, it's exactly where Lloyd Jowers said the shot was fired that actually killed King, not from the bathroom where James Earl Ray was supposedly shooting in the flop house across the street, but really from the bushes right across the street. So in other words, the sanitation department was sanitizing the scene of the crime. They were destroying the crime scene because within a couple of hours, early in the morning, by 9 a.m., they had cut down all the trees and bushes that would have obscured the shooter from observation, although some people did say they actually saw that shooter through the bushes, and the crime scene was no longer there. This was at the under the orders of the Memphis Police Department. That destruction of the crime scene had made a big impression on the jury, and as it did upon those of us who were hearing it.
Can I just interrupt you there for a second?
Sure.
I just want to draw those two parallels to the JFK assassination. You mentioned the rifle not being sighted in the James Earl Ray case. The same thing, folks, happened with the purported gun that Lee Harvey Oswald used to kill President Kennedy. It was a Mannlicher Carcano, and that too was not sighted. And everybody that examined the rifle said the same thing. This gun could not hit the broadside of a barn. The same thing that was said about the other rifle. Yeah. The other thing, too, there was a big tree that was right outside the Texas School Book Depository window where Oswald was supposed to have made those shots. And the next day, that tree was trimmed right down also to have a clear view between the Texas School Book Depository window and where JFK's limousine would have been on the street. And that reminds me right away of the sanitizing that went on with the Martin Luther King assassination when they took those bushes down.
And take it one step further, Brent. You mentioned the limousine.
Yes,
the limousine itself was sanitized, washed out from top to bottom, so that any evidence of the blood or the killing of Kennedy, and then of course the limousine was shipped to Detroit, Michigan, very secretly, and the windshield was replaced. So the destruction of the crime scene in the case of JFK includes the limousine as well as the Grassy Knoll and the area of Dealey Plaza.
Exactly, precisely. In the Dr. King assassination, there's a very famous photo. Dr. King has been fatally wounded. He's lying on the top of the motel's gallery where he was shot, second floor. People are pointing upwards towards, presumably, the rooming house. There's a person kneeling down right beside Dr. King.
Yes.
His name is McCullough.
Raul McCullough.
Can you speak about him, please, sir?
Raul McCullough was an infiltrator, an intelligence infiltrator, a member of the Memphis Police Department who infiltrated a group of community organizers that was working, black community organizers that was working in the Memphis area. They were called the Invaders. Mm-hmm. And McCullough, who also worked for Army Intelligence, he became actually the driver for this group, and then through their association with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he infiltrated the movement on that day. So he was a very effective guy, and subsequent to the assassination, he became a full-time employee of the Central Intelligence Agency until his retirement. So the man who was the first person to reach Dr. King, he went racing up the stairs from downstairs where he'd been driving a car for the Invaders, and who knelt beside Dr. King. The first person who reached his body was one of the people involved in the conspiracy to kill him. Lloyd Jowers, on the tape where he confesses his involvement, says that during the meetings to plan the assassination that were at Jim's Grill, he witnessed the involvement of Raul McCullough. So Raul McCullough is very integral to the plot to kill Dr. Martin Luther King.
In the trial, well, I guess I should ask you, what was the end result of the trial?
The end result of the trial, which involved a jury of 6 black and 6 white members, was their verdict that Martin Luther King was in fact killed by a conspiracy that included, and this is explicitly in their verdict, government agencies. That is explicitly in their verdict. Government agencies were involved in the killing of Martin Luther King. Now, I expected, huge headlines the next day. Forget it. There was hardly any notice of the trial's result, except in publications which derided that trial. And I know the sources, for example, the New York Times sent a reporter that appeared in the trial next to me. She sat next to me in the last 2 or 3 days of the trial. She heard none of the testimony of the trial. She heard only the closing arguments. But in her report in the New York Times, she described the jury as being half asleep. In fact, they were one of the best juries I'd ever seen. She just really paid no attention to any substance of the trial, and she couldn't have because she wasn't actually there. And that was really all that was reported in the papers nationwide, was the result of the trial, and that the trial held no water because either the jury was no good, the judge was no good, all kinds of deriding comments on the trial.
Well, let's speak to that a little bit. Let's talk about journalistic integrity.
Sure.
And perhaps the media at work as a spokesperson, if you will, for the CIA.
Well, the woman that I mentioned earlier, who was there for a few days from the Lisbon Daily Publico, she said to me one day as we were going out of the courtroom, she said she was very puzzled by this trial because people in this country, the United States, were always saying this or that is the trial of the century. That the Americans said that O.J. Simpson's trial was the trial of the century, or President Clinton's trial was the trial of the century. And she said, but this is the trial of the century, and who's here? And she looks around and she said, you a writer of books and me a reporter from Portugal. So what's going on here? Yeah, what is going on here? What's going on in terms of public media for an event that should be a huge focus and is being ignored? That's why I used the term the unspeakable for the assassination of President Kennedy, because there are certain things that are unspeakable in various places in the world, and in the United States it involves the assassinations of the 60s, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, that the U.S. government could have been directly involved, in fact, creating those assassinations. That's the unspeakable, and that's why no one wants to go there. No one wants to go to that point, and that's why that courtroom was virtually empty for the beginning periods of the beginning days of the trial, and only by word of mouth did people come to it. Mainly African Americans from Memphis who, they wanted to know what was going on, and I was there because I was a personal friend of William Pepper, and he told me about the trial, and so I went to it. But if you weren't in somehow inside a circle, you didn't even know that the trial was going on, and you certainly didn't know how important it was.
I didn't know you were friends with Mr. Pepper.
Only by calling him up, transatlantic phone call, and saying, why did you write this book, Orders to Kill, and how can I follow up on it? And he said, come to a courtroom in Memphis 2 weeks from now, and I showed up.
And you did. Good for you. We're laughing, folks, about the ironic connotations of all this, but in fact, Mr. Douglas is exactly right. Here was the trial of the century, and there was only 2 folks covering it. Often,
one of them from Portugal, and the other a book writer. Trial of the century.
Sometimes when I read the paper, I feel as if the person that is reporting on a story may have written the article before they actually witnessed what was going on or did any interviewing or any journalistic follow-through.
Yeah.
It's almost like this woman you described from New York had done the same thing. She had already written the article, except for maybe a few dates and names.
Yeah.
And she was going to file that story no matter what. And I find that's very sad. And again, if you're out there and you're a budding journalist, an investigative reporter, you want to go into this area, man, do we need you. We need you more than ever, because there are still secrets out there that have to be uncovered.
Still secrets. The world is full of them.
Oh, everywhere. And, not just assassinations that happened in the 60s.
No.
We can bring it right up to today. As Jim mentioned, he was in Iraq. There's a whole story there, folks, that you should go over and cover, because we in the West have not been exposed to the other side of the story. We've only been exposed to one perspective, and chances are that perspective has been watered down and fed to us in such a way that we're spoon-fed in sound bites of maybe a minute, maybe 30 seconds. And we don't get the human content that we so badly need of what's going on over there. Whether you support the war or not, there are people dying over there on both sides, and perhaps needlessly. So we have to look at that also.
As Martin Luther King did
please.
In his context in relation to the Vietnam War.
Exactly. I guess we're going to start to wrap up. We have about 10 minutes left. Is there something you would like to speak about that we haven't covered?
Maybe a little bit about John Kennedy, because he, in some ways, has been the most problematic and the most amazing person to me. As I mentioned earlier, I was quite skeptical of Kennedy's policies while he was president because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, and his having supported the concept of limited nuclear war, a contradiction in terms. And when I began to learn how he was turning away from that by my going through a huge number of documents that have been made public through a law that was passed in 1992, JFK Records Act, I was deeply moved at the courage of that man, analogous to the courage of Martin Luther King. And the way in which he turned in a new direction, to give a couple of examples that we haven't spoken about on the program yet, when he gave his American University address, his enemy, Nikita Khrushchev, responded to it saying, "This is the greatest speech any U.S. president has given since Franklin Roosevelt." Mm-hmm. And then in 6 weeks, an amazingly short time, signed with Kennedy the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And from that point on, Kennedy then kept going. He then tried to engage Fidel Castro in a dialogue to normalize U.S.-Cuban relations. He did that secretly through the United Nations, through an aide to Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador of the United Nations, and also through other people that he got to act as intermediaries with Castro. One was a reporter, Jean Daniel, who met with Kennedy in his White House Oval Office just before Daniel went down to Cuba to meet with Fidel Castro. And Daniel carried questions and messages from Kennedy to Castro, and Daniel was meeting with Castro, making that bridge from Kennedy at the very moment when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Castro had been deeply moved by what Daniel told him about Kennedy. They had met for almost an entire night a couple of days earlier because Castro couldn't believe what he was hearing about Kennedy's actual support of the vision of the Cuban Revolution. And it's not to say that Kennedy agreed with Castro. He was wanting to challenge him in terms of positions and statements that Castro had taken and made. But they were engaging one another. Kennedy was open to it, and Castro was being encouraged to engage in that dialogue by Nikita Khrushchev. So these people, who are all viewed as total adversaries in today's history, were coming together. And they were doing so also with the encouragement of a man named Pope John the 23rd, who served as an intermediary between Kennedy and Khrushchev. I've told all these stories in the book, but Kennedy was just moving, and of course we did not know a lot of this in terms of what was known publicly. But the Central Intelligence Agency and his military advisors certainly did. They were monitoring all of it, just as they were monitoring all of the movements of Martin Luther King in 1968, 5 years later. So Kennedy became an enemy from their standpoint to his national security state because he was engaging in peacemaking rather than in war-making, and didn't want to win the Cold War. He wanted to end it.
That's right.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
You know, I would always like to see a flurry of words instead of a flurry of bullets. As long as there's dialogue, there's no war.
Yes.
And it's so important to keep those lines of dialogue going. The United States has just come out and backed off a little bit of their policy against Cuba, and you can bet your bottom dollar, folks, there was a lot of back channel talking to bring that about. That just didn't happen overnight when somebody stands up and says, we're going to do this now. There's a lot of talking going on in the background, and you can be a part of that. You can go out there and assume one of those jobs. You can take poli-sci, whatever you want to do. You can go out there and be part of making policy. That's one of the challenges of democracy, is to build it for everybody.
Let's make a connection, if we could, Brent, between the Kennedy assassination and what's going on right now. The story of John F. Kennedy is not something that happened in 1963. It's something that is happening right now. Exactly the same story is occurring now.
Yes, it is.
That is to say that there is the possibility, and to a beginning degree, the reality of a president turning toward peace in a significant way. Now, when that happened in 63, when the president at that time had the courage to do so, he was kept from doing so. He was assassinated. During the campaign for the presidency, two of his closest relatives, his daughter Caroline and his brother Ted, endorsed the man who would become president, Barack Obama.
That's right.
Now, the question is that I'd like to share with your radio audience is where did that endorsement take place? Where did Caroline and Ted Kennedy, at a fairly early stage in Barack Obama's campaign, come out of the shadows and say, we support this man to become president of the United States? The answer is American University.
Yes.
American University. The meaning of that endorsement, if we know our history, and that history has been eradicated, and very deliberately eradicated from our consciousness, the meaning of that endorsement was that Caroline and Ted Kennedy were saying, we hope and believe that this particular candidate will carry out the vision that John F. Kennedy presented at American University in his greatest speech, June 10, 1963, for which he was assassinated.
Absolutely.
The story continues, and unless we know the story in its origin, we don't know the story that's going on today, and we can't prevent it from reaching the same conclusion, because it's we who either stand between that president and those who would take him out the way they took out JFK. I'm talking about forces here now. I'm not talking about individuals.
That's right.
The individuals of 63 are long gone. I'm talking about institutional forces, the same kind of forces that removed from our midst Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy. Those forces continue to exist actually in every country, not just this particular one. But when you get one that's the most powerful in the history of the world in terms of military forces, that unspeakable power becomes very, very serious. And it repeats the story. It repeats the story. JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, same story, repeated, and we don't want it repeated again. And it's up to us to keep it from being repeated again by our knowledge, our consciousness, and our action.
What an inspiring statement you've just made. That's beautiful. That is truly beautiful. Perhaps, Jim, you can give out your mail address again in case folks want to get in touch with you to help out in whatever capacity they can.
Well, we just like to be in touch with good people anywhere, and I'm a Canadian as well as an American, and first of all, a world citizen, I hope. And our address is Mary's House, our house of hospitality for whomever really needs hospitality, but especially people right now who are relatives or friends of people in medical institutions in Birmingham. Birmingham has become a hospital center, and there are a lot of people who don't have the funds to pay anything at all when they come into town. So we give hospitality to them especially, but also peace and justice people who come through town. Just come see us or write us a letter, whatever. And glad to send you our newsletter, too, if you really want to hear something of this nature. We're at 2107 Avenue G, Birmingham, AL for Alabama, 35218.
Okay.
35218 is the correct zip code for Mary's House, and that's, of course, USA.
Okay. I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you. It's been a great gift, Brent. You've got a terrific show, and I know that there's a terrific community out there as a part of it. So it's been a privilege.
It's been an inspiring evening
tonight.
It truly has. You've inspired me, my friend. You really have, sincerely. I want to thank you once again, and God bless you.
Thank you, Brent, and God bless you and everybody out there.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, sir.
You too.
Bye now. Jim Douglas. And Jim has a great book out called JFK and the Unspeakable, which can be got anywhere across the country at Chapters Indigo. Wasn't that great, folks? That was Jim Douglas. Jim Douglas is a legend in the JFK assassination community. And he's writing a book right now on his experiences. As he was saying, he covered this trial. And the trial took place in 1999. And it was the King family and a fellow by the name of William Pepper who proceeded to have a trial to try and bring the truth out about the Martin Luther King assassination and its conspiracy. And it ties back to military intelligence and the powers that be. And he was speaking about various anomalies. For example, this bag that was left very conveniently on Main Street, purported to be James Earl Ray's bag. Inside the bag were some toiletry items. There was the rifle that was purported to have made the shot to kill Dr. King, and a radio, and inside the radio was a number, the number related to James Earl Ray's prison number. So this would have been the radio that he had in prison. Just too many coincidences to be nothing else but a conspiracy. There's so many parallels between this conspiracy, Bobby's, Malcolm's, and JFK's. Basically what it is, folks, it seems every time a person comes out for peace, somehow or another they are targeted and taken out of the equation. And I want to come back to the inspiring things Dr. King and also Jim Douglas has just spoke about. You can make a difference. Go out there, grab that bull by the horn, write an article. Say, I'm against this. Go ahead, you can do it. You can make a difference in this world, and you will make a difference in this world. You can inspire people. You can inspire change for the better and bring about peace in the long run. Next week, Lisa Pease returns. Lisa Pease was here last week. As you know, we had a lot of fun with her. Lisa Pease and I will be talking about Nikola Tesla. We're going to go away from the conspiracy thing in the month of May, and we're going to be talking about different aspects. For example, we're going to be talking about terrorism the week after that. Deborah Conway will be here from JFK Lancer. The week after that, Whitley Strieber will be here. As you know, Whitley Strieber is a famous author in the United States. He's had several of his books made into blockbusters. His most popular one in the 80s was Communion. Then there was Wolfen, The Hunger. A couple of years ago, there was a really good movie he did. Actually, a book that was made into a movie, a Hollywood blockbuster with Dennis Quaid in it. It was called The Day After Tomorrow. That's the one where the world freezes over because of global warming. You may have seen it. So that was from Whitley Strieber's books. He's got all kinds of great books like that. So he'll be here. Cold Spot's coming back. Remember Cold Spot was here October 31st? They helped celebrate Haunted Halloween here at Night Fright. They are going to drive up again from Collingwood. That is going to be one blast of a show. I'm going to invite the world. World, if you're listening, May 27th between 10 and midnight. Come on down to the studios at CKLU and join us. The whole team will be here. There's 5 of them. They're going to be here talking about their various investigations, what they found, spirituality. You can even ask questions. Live right on air. No problem. I'll let you right in the studio. Mark that one down, May 27th. The month of June. Bobby Kennedy was killed 2 months after Dr. King. Only 2 months. Not 2 years, 3 years, whatever. 2 months after. And I can't tell you the wind that was taken out of our sails when that happened. We are going to do a whole month on Bobby Kennedy. And once again, you're going to hear the same damn names coming up in the Bobby Kennedy assassination. Eerily, eerily, eerily scary. Mark Sobel will be here with an award-winning film he's done, feature film. He's going to be talking about that. It's called Remembering Bobby. July. July is UFO month, folks. Are we going to have a blast? An all-Canadian lineup in July. In the dark. Full moon. Little mist for atmosphere. Shh. Turn the lights off. Go ahead. Go over to the light switch right now. Turn them off. Shh. Did you hear that in the dark in the corner? We're talking about UFOs in July. Don't be scared. It's only radio. Week 1, July 1st, Canada Day. Michel Deschamps returns. We're going to talk about sightings in Northern Ontario, in Northern Canada, and Canada in general. Going to be a blast of a show. Michel Deschamps is a wonder. He just pulls names and dates just like that. He knows his stuff inside out. Week 2, I bet you didn't even know Canada had a Roswell. Yes, indeed, folks. Canada has a Roswell with dead alien bodies, the whole 9 yards. We had missile ships and we had submarines all heading to Nova Scotia. We are going to be talking about Canada's Roswell, Shag Harbor. Stand by for that one with legendary UFOologist Don Ledger. Stanton Friedman will be here the week after, and we'll be talking about Canada's connection in the Corona affair. The week after that, we're going to have 2 UFOologists on from Manitoba, and those folks are Chris Reed and Chris Rutowski. Chris Rutowski has written several books on alien abductions, so we're looking forward to that one too in August. Get ready. We're going to get horror August, I'm going to call it. August 12th. Werewolves. Talking about werewolves on a full moon. So that's coming up on Night Fright. Next week, we're going to be talking about, with Lisa Pease, we're going to be talking about Nikola Tesla. Thanks for listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. See you next time.
You're listening to Night Fright, and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio.